I'm Sara Calvo. I'm a lecturer here at CIPA, Colombia. And it's a real pleasure to be here, surrounded by colleagues, former colleagues, and friends. We're going to start this session with the introduction from Martin Rama. For those of you who join us just this session, he's the director of the World Development Report of this year. So, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say two words on how we frame to our management the way forward from this report. What we said to our bosses, if we were in charge, which we are not, what will we do differently as a result of this report? As I mentioned yesterday, our team is disbanding. Our role finishes almost this weekend as a team. And it's up to others to see whether it's something worth picking up from the report and doing something about it. So I would say two words about implications for policy, and my colleague and Deputy Director of the WDR, Kathleen, will say two words about implications for research and data in 1 minute, each of us. The two words on the policy side, we say basically three things to our management. The first one is we will take jobs out of the corner where they currently are. In the way we operate, we think growth, we think poverty reduction, and then we have a sectoral approach to jobs. We have people who specialize in skills, active labor programs, labor regulation, social protection, and what we're saying, jobs is much broader than that. The reasons why there may not be enough creation of jobs, and especially not enough creation of the jobs that are transformational from a development point of view, may very well be elsewhere. They may be in urbanization policies, they may be in land policies, they may be in product markets, and if we go to corner jobs there, that will not work. Second is, the second message after taking jobs out of that corner is look through the jobs lens. We have a series of diagnostics we use in development, and quite often, because we focus on growth, they take K, the capital, as the variable on which we base our analysis. Take the growth diagnostics, the binding constraints, the Andres Velasco, Daniel Roderick, Ricardo Hausmann approach. And basically what they do is they look at where is that the marginal productivity of capital doesn't seem to match the cost of capital, and try to identify where are the constraints of why this is happening. The problem can be formally written exactly the same way and solved exactly the same way on L, on labor, as opposed to capital. And the advantage of doing it on labor is that when you do it in capital, you don't see whether you are talking about men or women, cities or rural areas, young people or not, which kind of firms. It's an aggregate. Looking at L, even if the data has limitations, Caldina will say a word about it, gives us much more texture on when the discrepancies between market prices and shadow prices are, which we try to do through these other diagnostics. And we have other examples. If you take what we do in urbanization, in fact, urbanization is about jobs. So using spatially data on employment to think about transport master plans and things like that is another way in which we think we should be working differently. And third is, while labor markets are very important for jobs, don't take for granted that the constraint is always in the labor market. Of course, when you compare across industrial countries where most of the other things are in place, where there is good governance, good infrastructure, and so on and so forth, it's easier to see how variations in labor policies make a difference. But in some cases, in developing countries, there are such huge imperfections, market power connections, that just going after jobs, after labor policies as our entry point to fix jobs problems may be a bit misguided. So these were the three things we said on policy, and now Kathleen will say a couple of things we said on research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. So Looking forward, coming out of the WDR, I want to just focus on two areas. One is on data and the availability of data, and a research agenda for labor in developing and middle-income economies. On the data side, the end of the WDR kind of takes a traditional approach, what you see in most WDRs, which is a call for more data. We always want more data. We want more data, we want better data, and we want data to become available to the public. Just to highlight the lack of data, the issue of lack of data, if we just look at the most recent crisis, if we look towards national household surveys to measure labor force trends and patterns, since 2008, so 2008, 9, 10, 11, in the Africa region, as defined by the World Bank, for 41 countries, only 11 countries have national household surveys that offer an opportunity to measure labor force. In the Middle East and North Africa region, we have 6 countries where we have such information at a national level. But 2 of those countries, effectively, the data sets can't be shared even within the World Bank. So where the data even exists, it's not made readily available within the bank, let alone the larger research community. So when you go to the World Bank World Development Indicators page and you look at unemployment numbers for Africa, the vast majority are actually modeled by the ILO. They're not from any real underlying survey data. We also, at the same time, we need better data in the surveys that we have in addition to more surveys. And I think the future lies in potentially linking household survey efforts with a vision of firms and enterprises, particularly when we want to know more about micro enterprises. The household survey data offer a sample frame for identifying what's really going on at the micro enterprise level. But these are 2 groups of research communities and data collection efforts that rarely talk to each other. So within the bank, you have the enterprise survey effort, and then you have the poverty, labor, household survey effort. And they're not overlapping. And that's really, I think, leading to limitations in the data that we have. We're getting more panel data, and that's bright for the future, but we're not really seeing any panels on enterprises yet. And we also struggle with sufficient sample sizes to look at these heterogeneous effects that we heard about in the last session. But moving forward, I think there's this real challenge about who's going to do the data work. I think it's unrealistic to rely on the national statistical agencies to really vastly scale up the work that they're doing. They face a lot of constraints financially and in terms of capacity. So I think the research community is going to be an important source of information on what's happening in labor markets. And I'll give one example. Yesterday, we heard about the study from Indonesia that looked at the link between job transitions and civic participation. It was the only study where we really had what we think was some causal evidence around this relationship between the role of having a job and participating actively in society. And that data comes from a research project out of the RAND Institute, the Indonesia Family Life Survey. It's not an NSO-produced data set, but it was important for our report. And I think many of the studies we cite are drawing on researcher created data sets. So they'll continue to be a really important source going forward. On the research side, I think there have been a number of topics that have come up where we just really don't know much. I mean, in the last session, we heard about the idea of how are labor markets really functioning in developing economies, and what do we really know about that? What do we know about the cliffs, where they are, the heterogeneous points of the cliffs across countries, within countries for different groups? And what do we know about how to measure some of the topics that we're concerned about? How do we functionally measure social cohesion? How do we measure job transitions when we don't have panel data? Can we rely on people to recall job histories, to reconstruct to what extent churning is happening if we can measure that in household surveys? So I think there's a rich agenda moving forward. I really look forward to hearing more ideas on where we should take it on the research side and the data side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right, we have a very distinguished panel. I will introduce them at the time they talk. And let's start with Ned Phelps, our Ned Phelps. Ned is a McKeever Professor of Political Economy and Director of the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia. He's the winner of the 2006 Nobel Prize in Economics. And much of his work has been focused on entrepreneurship. So I'm not sure whether that's the focus of your talk, Ned, today, but it will be nice to hear your views on that too. Each panelist will have 10 minutes, and then we'll come back with
stand up?
Whatever you feel more comfortable.
Okay, I think I'll be closer to my notes if I can do it from the table. Good morning. Thank you, Jan, for inviting me, and thank you, Sara, for introducing me. It's nice to be in what is for me a new group. Economists, I'm sure you agree. Okay. Economists, I'm sure you agree, have long emphasized that there cannot be much development of an economy without wide availability and affordability of higher education. I want to agree with that, and I think to some extent I do agree with that. I know, for example, that in the 100 or so greatest years of the American economy, which would be something like, say 1865 to 1965, when productivity was growing at an unprecedented speed. Come hell or high water, depressions, inflations, wars, didn't much matter. Productivity was leaping ahead. In that period, America was I think, certainly had the, best of my knowledge, it had the best educated labor force in the world. And I often think of my mother's family in southern Illinois. They planted corn. They were very successful. And my mother and all of her 7 siblings, all of them went to college. This was in the early 1920s. Farmers in southern Illinois. It was not anything that was thought to be remarkable. But certainly there are some reasons for doubt or qualification. I've just come back from Moscow and St. Petersburg, where I came to be reminded that there's so many people in that country with high education, and yet they just are frustrated because they can't find any way to use it. The more fortunate ones have gone on for advanced study in the United States, and it's suspected that they'll never come back. There's just not enough going on in the economy of Russia to employ them. But the point that's germane to what I wanted to say was Russia is an example where you have a big supply of people with high education, but where's the development? Now, I've emphasized in some of my work that higher education has a higher rate of return, private and social, the more innovative the economy is, especially the more the indigenous innovation, indigenous innovation is going on. You know, there are 2 kinds of innovation, homegrown and borrowed from abroad. And those aren't exactly the same things. To some extent, they're come to the same thing, but there are differences. Education theorists used to say, I don't know whether they're still saying it now, but education theorists used to say that the function of education is to learn how to learn. And at an applied level, the function of education is to solve problems, master new things. And so that would fit in with the idea that a society needs to have a wide availability and affordability of high education, when there's a lot of stuff going on in the economy that would benefit from high education. Of course, John Dewey is maybe the most prominent voice in viewing education that way. Other names would spring to mind if it weren't so early in the morning. Now, that brings to my mind the United States these days. How come that the United States, which was pretty much leading the pack in 1990, when I saw an OECD compilations of the percentage of the labor force with a university degree, and U.S. was right at the top there. How come that 22 years later, we see that the United States is no longer at the top? Is that because things happened in this country that caused the supply of education to contract, the supply available to people to contract? Or is it that something happened to the character of the economy that caused a drop in the demand for education? In some work that I've been doing relatively recently, I've argued, I have to say on the basis of very scrappy evidence, that there seems to be a decline in the rate of innovation in the American economy. And I wonder whether the decline in higher education in the United States is to some extent the effect of the decline in economic dynamism in the U.S. economy. Now, coming back to the function of education and John Dewey and all that, the Nelson and Phelps paper of 1966, which some of you might be old enough to have read, said that education plays a very special role. It equips and thus also encourages potential users of new products or new methods to examine those new products and new methods. And in that way, it contributes to the adoption of new products and methods begging to be introduced into the economy. I was very proud of that paper at the time because I thought it offered some stiff competition to the Jacob Mincer, Gary Becker theory that human capital is a sort of a lump that you calculate by adding up the number of years of schooling, and then you slot that in the production function, and that's the role of education. I thought that view was horribly deficient. And the Nelson Phelps paper offered an alternative. I have to say, though, that I'm still waiting for some econometric results that give the Nelson Phelps view a lot of support compared to the Mincer-Becker view. But I haven't given up hope. It's a complicated subject, and I think it's a strong possibility that none of us, myself included, has yet hit upon the right econometric formulation that would bring out the merit, whatever it may be, of the two views. Another point I want to make, and this I think will be my last point, is that first of all, I've talked about the mistake that you can sort of pump development into an economy by boosting educational attainments. There's also the myth going around that there would be more innovators and more innovatorship if there was more higher education. But one of the puzzles in the data for years and years, which used to bother Will Baumhol no end, was that the innovators are striking for their lack of higher education. And now, to some extent, that view was corrected by the well-known labor economist at the Hoover Institute, who worked for a while with in the Bush administration. I can't remember his name this morning. Who? Ed Lazier. Thank you, Ed Lazier. Ed Lazier said, not exactly. He said, an entrepreneur is somebody with a remarkably wide range of abilities. So if there's a flood in the roof, he might have an idea about how to deal with it, while most of us wouldn't. That sort of thing. But of course, that may be more characterological. Is there such a word? That may be more a matter of the character of a person than his education. Maybe an entrepreneur is just somebody who's a very can-do person, and he gets involved in a lot of things, and he does acquire a lot of practical knowledge through that involvement. And it doesn't tell us, we shouldn't conclude from Lazier's work that we can induce an increase in the number of innovators in the economy and can improve their innovatorship. I just invented that word last week in St. Petersburg. And we can increase their innovatorship by force-feeding them more higher education. I don't think that I would caution against concluding that. So, to conclude, the relationship of education to development seems to me to still be very, very complicated and somewhat elusive, and maybe just so rich that we can only get pieces of it. But, of course, it is quite important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ned. Our next speaker will be Marty Chen. Let me get... he is a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School and international coordinator of the Global Research Policy Action Network, Women in Informal Employment. And this is it.
Good morning. I want to first thank and congratulate the WDR team. And I also want to thank Jan and Ravi, also congratulate them, because I think this convening has been very stimulating. I'm going to speak about informal labor and development and the way forward. And I've taken my lead from the WDR team, and so I was tweaking my tweets early this morning. And so this is the summary of what I'm going to say. The informal is normal. Most jobs are created in or by the informal economy, and most working poor are informally employed. Informal jobs can be transformational if, and the if is if formalization includes benefits and rights, not just costs and duties, and if the working poor in the informal economy receive protection, promotion, and participation, what I call the 3 Ps. Appropriate policies, regulations, and models matter. And to be appropriate, they need to match the reality of work today. Labor policies, as we've talked throughout this conference, matter less than assumed. Labor market models need to be revised, and policies and regulations need to be reformed. And for the way forward, I would argue, we should embrace economic diversity, let the informal and traditional operate alongside the formal and modern, just the way it is today in most of the developing world, although with some constraints. And we should create a level playing field for the working poor in the informal economy. So those are my tweets, and here's some. First, just because we've talked about the informal workforce quite a bit, I thought it would be important just to say what it is, because there's always some confusion. The informal workforce, it's large and diverse, but it can be meaningfully classified by what is called status and employment. So you have the self-employed and the informal enterprises, and there are statistical official international definitions. These are unincorporated, small, or unregistered enterprises, and they're wage workers in informal jobs. And the official international definition is jobs without employer contributions to social protection. Among the self-employed, I think it's really important, and the data shows it, to distinguish between the employers who hire others. They're the ones who are the entrepreneurial class. They, on average, earn above the poverty threshold or the minimum wage threshold. There are a lot of what are called own account operators who do not hire others, and their earnings are often around what the employees of the employers in informal enterprises earn. And then, of course, there are a lot of unpaid contributing family workers, particularly women, but certainly not only women. And then the wage workers in informal jobs. There are informal employees of formal firms, something that Clara was trying to get to through her data on the unofficial earnings. There are casual day laborers who might work with a formal firm one day or an informal firm the other, and all kinds of subcontracted workers and industrial outworkers. So it's a broad group, and we have increasingly data, but not enough, on all of these categories. I'd like to give you a sneak preview of an ILO WIGO publication that's coming out in a month or two that Joanne Vanek, my colleague here, who's the head of our statistics program, is the lead author on. And these are regional estimations of informal employment in non-agricultural employment. We still don't have an agreed upon definition of informality in agriculture. So most of the, and you'll see that it ranges from, in the regions, from 45% in the MENA region to 82% of non-agricultural employment in the South Asia. I spoke to Ruggie over coffee this morning, and he said if you took the public sector out of the MENA figures, because of total employment, 20 to 25% is still in the public sector, although there's a crisis in that employment. And if you just took private employment, it would be closer to 80%, was his guess of what it is, more like South Asia. The formalization debate. This is where we have to get our policies rethought. Those of us who work on the informal economy, everyone says, let's just formalize it. And I say, okay, what do you mean, right? Now, to some observers, it means we're going to take everyone out of these low productivity activities over here, and we're going to give them formal wage jobs. Well, folks, the trends are all in the opposite direction. Whatever wage employment's increasing, it's mainly informal wage employment, and self-employment is on the rise in many places. So that's still a target, a goal, but it's not a particularly realistic one. The other main approach to formalization is that you register and tax those informal enterprises who are providing unfair competition to the formal enterprises. That's the other standard approach. What we've learned is that a lot of informal enterprises do pay taxes or fees, not all, but many, and they would like a few of the benefits of being formal in return for those taxes and fees. And so we need to think about the benefits of formalization for both the informal enterprises and entrepreneurs, but also for the informal wage workers. And these benefits could include legal and social protections, the right to organization and representation. They're on that cliff of not having voice and social protection, and government support of various kinds. It could be the services, basic infrastructure, procurement. They'd like to be able to bid for solid waste management contracts or other contracts, and incentives. And we don't see this as a one-step process. It isn't that you just go to a single office and you register and suddenly you're formal. This is an incremental process over time. And so the 3x3 policy framework, I like little mnemonic devices you can see, is yes, please expand formal employment opportunities and also formalize as many informal enterprises and informal jobs as desirable and feasible, but you have to create some incentives for that. And then there are going to be a lot of folks still in the informal workforce, a lot of the working poor, and they would like the protection of legal and social protection, promotion. They would like the supportive infrastructure and services, but they also need a fair policy and regulatory environment. And they would like to be able to have a representative voice in the rule-setting, policy-making, collective bargaining institutions and processes. But if we're going to include the informal workforce, we need quite a bit of policy and institutional reform. If you really look at labor law, if you look at employment law, if you look at various policies, they're all premised on a formal employment relationship or a formal incorporated firm. So we have a need to change. We need to change our models of how labor markets are structured and also how they behave. There's an institutional mismatch between the mechanisms for legal and social protection and the realities of informal employment. There are policy biases that favor the larger firms and the formal labor force over the smaller firms and the informal labor force. And there are huge power imbalances. I'm glad Ravi brought up the whole issue of the structure of markets, and he knows well that those of us who aren't economists don't understand this idea of highly competitive markets. We see all kinds of power imbalances and also imbalances in market knowledge and access. And we also see a lot of downloading of risks from the lead firms through their suppliers to the intermediaries to the dependent workers and producers at the bottom of the value chain. So the idea that you have an informal economy here and a formal economy here, and the informal economy is providing unfair competition to the formal economy, just doesn't work for a lot of it. We've got a lot of informal workers and producers very much tied in to formal firms through all kinds of contracting and supply chains. Labor market models. Now, I'm not an economist. I will quickly do that. And I believe in descriptive models. I'm not good. I don't do predictive models. But there's something about labor market models that I think have to change. We don't see that when wages go down, people just opt not to work. We see underemployment leading to long working hours. We see lowered wages and earnings actually leading to increased labor supply. And if a third to half of the world is self-employed, we really do have to think through demand and supply, because they both demand and supply labor. And the market they compete in is the markets for goods and services. So the constraints to demand that they face are the derived demand for goods and services, not for their labor per se, or at least that's not how I see it. And the constraints to supply include the lack of credit, assets, and skills, but also lack of market knowledge and power, and especially if you're a woman, various social norms that give you the responsibility for unpaid work. So I think a lot of rethinking of labor market models. And we've had this theme that we need to think beyond labor policies in the informal labor market. Labor policies have really limited salience in the informal labor market. Most informal workers are self-employed, and most informal self-employed do not hire others. So there's a tiny group, and it's somewhere around 5, 6, 7% of all informal self-employed that are employers, where labor regulations would be something that you might want them to comply with. And many informal wage workers are outside any kind of recognized employer-employee relationship. And so there are really a whole set of other policies to increase demand for informal goods and services. We have to encourage productive investment, extend basic services, including infrastructure services. Yes, build human capital, but we also have to improve access to markets. And we have to reform sector-specific rules and regulations. I didn't realize that economists thought industrial policy was a distortion. Anyway, I have a lot to learn. But sector-specific policies are really what are impacting. If you're an urban informal worker, a street vendor, a waste picker, it's what the city does. It's the city's norms about who can do what and where, and not just the norms, but the actual practices. It's the local officials, it's the police, it's the retail industry as competition. And we have to allow these organizations of these workers to compete for public procurement. So I think we really have to rethink labor in development. It's beyond employment and unemployment, the simple model, to look at underemployment and the quality of employment. We have to think beyond labor markets. A lot of them are competing in markets for goods and services and in financial, or trying to compete in financial markets. We have to look beyond labor policies and labor regulations. We have to look beyond just the demand for labor, but also the demand for their goods and services. And we have to look in a holistic way about the supply of labor, because there are a lot of constraints on the supply of labor. And we have to look beyond supply and demand and look at institutions. Market transactions, commercial relationships, the dynamics within the subsector or value chains within which they are inserted. And we do have to look at sector policies, including urban policies. And finally, we need a different vision of the future. Most of our visions of, for instance, where cities should go are modeled on Shanghai. Everything should be shining and bright. And the challenge is to convince policymakers to promote and encourage what Ila Bhatt, the founder of SEWA, calls hybrid economy. She was also an advisor, I believe quite a prized advisor to the WDR. So we need hybrid economies. That's what we have in the world. Why are we trying to make them so linear and so monolithic, in which you can have the small and the large, the modern and traditional side by side? And so we need to have a principle of economic diversity, much the way some at least adopted biodiversity. And we do need a more level playing field between the formal economy and the informal economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marty. Our next speaker is Santiago Levy. Santiago is the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he also served as General Manager and Chief Economist for the Research Department in recent years. He has been Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico, and he has been, or he still is, the architect of the social program Progress on Opportunity. So, Santiago, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Sara. And let me begin by thanking Ravi and Jan for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And congratulating Martina and everybody in the World Bank team for a very nice report. My comments are based on a reading of about half of the report, but the half that I've read, it's actually a very enjoyable report. And it's sort of, as I was thinking about it, what it's trying to do, as I understand it, is trying to say, you've got to think about the labor issue in a different way. And I think it's a wake-up call to labor economists to broaden their minds and broaden perspective and sort of put more things on the table when discussing job creation than just the standard discussions about labor market policies. And if that's the takeaway central message of the report, I think it's very welcome. And this sort of more holistic view about what should happen for jobs is a very, very welcome report. Sort of it's jobs is development versus growth is development kind of message is what I think is in the report, and I think is very nice. I think the report very nicely does not focus on unemployment. It's really not the central issue for most developing countries. I think the report very correctly focuses on issues of the composition of employment between self-employment and other types of wage employment, between formal and informal, between temporary and part-time, and a lot on the quality of employment. So the focus on the issues is right, and the thrust of looking at the whole ecosystem, so to speak, is right. And the policies, and I'll come back to that at the end, that are being sort of suggested in the report is thinking about the way forward is sort of the way to go. So what I like to do in the time that was allocated to me is basically make 3 points. I want to make 3 points, state my biases from the beginning. My biases are very much from a Latin American view of the world, and perhaps I should have been in the morning panel rather than in this panel, in the more regional views of this. I know very little, unfortunately, I apologize, about African or Asian labor markets, or at least European labor markets. I sort of work mostly in Latin America, and so I'll give you some biases and some reactions from that perspective. So the first point is, the report says here and there that the self-employed are outside of the labor market. And the treatment of the self-employed, I think, is really important. And the treating them as outside of the labor market is, from a Latin American perspective, I reiterate, I think not quite the way to get it. There's a lot of data that shows that there are transits of individual workers between self-employment and salaried employment. So this is panel data that follow workers through their lifetimes. I've done some of this on my own work in Mexico. In any single year, 25% of workers that were self-employed the previous year have gotten a salaried job in the next year, and about 18% of salaried workers in that year get a job as a self-employed worker in the next year. So there's a lot of transit between back and forth. We've done some work for Peru, we've done some work for Colombia, we find numbers along those magnitudes. We don't have sufficient data for other countries in Latin America, but there's a lot of movement between self-employment and salaried employment. What this means is that the dividing line between an entrepreneur and a salaried worker is somewhat endogenous. It is shifting all the time for reasons that we have to fully understand better. You know, it has to do with taxes, subsidies, with the whole incentive structure that everybody's facing. But clearly, it does matter that somebody sometimes is an entrepreneur, sometimes is a salaried worker. He shifts back and forth. And this shifting has implications for productivity, because if a salaried worker only part of the time, he can't invest a lot in labor training, in on-the-job learning, you know, in sort of skills that you acquire little by little. There's a lot of precariousness, so to speak, to the labor relationship. I think these transits are very important from the point of view of productivity for the reason that I mentioned before, but also from the point of view of social insurance, because coverage of social insurance is associated with whether you're salaried or not salaried. And so self-employment is an area, Kathleen was speaking about further research, we need to understand better what determines this dividing line between entrepreneurs and wage workers, and why is this line shifting all the time, and why are the same people continuously in these two positions. So it's an area that needs more work, but the notion that they're outside of the labor market, it's somehow, at least from an American perspective, doesn't strike the right balance. My second comment is on this. I was not here yesterday, unfortunately, but I heard some of the remarks this morning, and I sort of went through the text there on the notion of these plateaus and these cliffs, and the relationship between employment protection legislation and these plateaus and these cliffs. John made and Clara made some arguments this morning about how difficult it is to identify exactly what's going on in these relationships and why the econometric work behind it is so difficult to say whether the effects are zero or not zero. I agree with the report that a lot of what is going on in some ranges when employment protection legislation is changing is a lot of redistribution, and that sometimes it's not that much efficiency. But I like to have a more nuanced view of that. In my interpretation, when these legislations are changing, or social insurance legislation, somehow expected costs and expected benefits are changing. And firms react and workers react to the expected incentive structure when all this changes. And they react in ways, at least in Latin America, that bring in a dimension that I think is not fully reflected in the report, which is they react a lot through illegal behavior. So there's a lot of salaried employment that is illegal. We use the word informal salaried, but I think that's actually wrong. It should be illegal salaried, because if it's salaried, according to the legislation of most of these countries, they should be formal. And if it's informal salaried, it's illegal. And the illegality dimension brings in some important complications that impacts productivity. I'm borrowing here a lot of work from Ravi on sort of whether enforcement is done, how is it done, and how firms react to it. But in contexts in which enforcement is imperfect, which is the case in most Latin American countries, illegal behavior will be a dimension of the reaction to the changes in the incentive structure associated with employment protection laws and social insurance, and this will impact productivity. Because if you're behaving illegally, you're small. And growing is costly because the risk of detection is higher, and this matters for the sort of distortions that John was talking about this morning, and it's part of the explanation of the very important dispersion that we see in marginal products across firms and across sizes of firms, even within well-defined sectors. And in work done at the IDB by others and myself, what we find is that even narrowly defined six-digit sectors, you find, controlling for size and everything, huge difference in marginal products of labor and capital of firms between being formal, being informal, or being illegal and being legal. And so this dimension matters. And so the plateau, yes, there's a lot of distribution going on, but I think there's a little bit more than just redistribution going on. And it's difficult to pick up in the econometric studies because a lot of the illegalities were not showing up and we're not picking it up there. There's another dimension of the plateau which I think is also important. As this shifting of labor occurs between self-employment and salary, and within salary between legal and illegal, there's more than just a distribution occurring. There's also changes in the coverage of social insurance. Because social insurance is very much associated with the fact that you're formal with a legal salary job, and as you shift along this plateau, social insurance is changing for the same individuals. So the same individuals are sometimes being covered against risks and sometimes are not being covered up against risk. And this has huge implications not only for protecting against risk and social cohesion, but for, say, the pension systems. The pension systems in Latin America, most of them were reformed in the 1990s, but they were still connected to the functioning of the labor market because it's associated with the formal status. And what you find is that contribution rates to the pension systems are very low. Replacement rates are going to be very low. And the role of consumption smoothing and risk smoothing that is going to be done by the social insurance system is done very imperfectly. And sort of this, it doesn't work well against the social cohesion. So I think this is an area where we need a lot more work and a lot more research, understanding this. I'm just putting some nuances. I'm not disagreeing fundamentally, I'm just putting some nuances. A little bit of the message of the report is employment protection legislation and social insurance legislation has been overplayed in an over-dimension in terms of the importance for labor markets. I agree with that. There are other things going on that we need to look at, and I'll come back to that when I speak about policy for a minute. But the notion that the expected cost and expected benefits associated with legislation and the social insurance taxation is not changing behavior of firms and workers, I think it doesn't really square a lot. Again, with the landmark and evidence for the reasons that I described earlier before. Let me then just come quickly, because I'm sort of running out of time, to speak a little bit about, this is my third point on policy. The thrust of what the report is pointing to, I agree. I think the jobs issue is much bigger than just labor market policy, and it's just much bigger than social insurance. And the points that Martin was making, not only taking labor market policy out of the corner, but also putting everything to the jobs issue is fundamental. And I think an important chapter we need to look at when we look further for labor market, for jobs policies that are not labor market policies in this broader view of the report, is I'd like to call attention to fiscal. The fiscal part of the problem, I think labor economists, we would gain a lot by doing a lot more of fiscal stuff. Let me give you two examples. Many Latin American countries have these special tax regimes for very, very small firms. They're called régimen de pequeños contribuyentes, small taxpayers regimes. And basically what they do is they say, look, firms with up to some value of sales are usually not going to be subject to the income tax law and the value-added tax law as all firms. They're going to have a simplified regime in which they just pay a percentage of sales. But after that threshold, firms have to pay the full income taxes and value-added taxes. That does two things. What it does, it introduces a discontinuity in the after-tax profit tax functions of firms, because profits are increasing with sales, but then you change the tax regime, and then profits actually are negative, fall until you get a much bigger size. So there's some hole in the middle there. That partly accounts, I believe, for the size distribution of firms, and partly accounts for a lot of these firms that then generate these jobs that are not the quality jobs that we like. So I think in terms of the philosophy of the report, looking beyond labor policies, tax policies are clearly a very important area that are introducing distortions that have a lot to do with labor and the quality of labor and the quality of employment. The VAT regime is another one. Sometimes these VAT regimes don't allow small firms to credit sales to the other firms because they're in the small tax regime. So they cannot be suppliers to the other firms, and they cannot be procurers, and all these distortions are coming from the tax act. Yet a third one is coming from the income taxes. In many legislation, the treatment of salaried income from wages and the treatment of income from other sources is not symmetrical. And usually what it is, in at least what we've seen in American countries, is discriminates against salaried income. And that's because enforcement is easier because workers are in firms. It's very difficult to measure income when workers are self-employed. And so the taxation introduces distortions. To sum up, looking beyond labor market policies and opening up the other areas, I spoke about fiscal, clearly will do a lot to help. And with that nuance, I would say that a jobs approach to development would certainly look at these broader issues, but I would say we do have to look more carefully at the social insurance, and we have to look more carefully at the employment protection, because these plateaus and cliffs have more than one dimension, and they have impacts in these other areas associated with productivity and social insurance. With that, I think there's what I've seen so far, and I have to be honest, about half of the report that I've seen I've enjoyed much, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot more from the other half. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Santiago. Our next speaker is Arvind Panagariya. He's a professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. I understand he's going to give us the Indian perspective, and I'm sure largely based on a book that he has written recently on India, the Emerging Giant.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here. I counted on the program alone, I am the 33rd speaker of the conference. This is about a 400-page report. I'm sure anything and everything worth saying has already been said. So if I say something, either it's going to be repetitive or something that was not worth saying. Nevertheless, I'm not a labor economist. I come from a very policy perspective, and my preoccupation these days is India. And so I see things from an Indian lens. So I follow Santiago here very much that maybe I should have been on the previous panel on regional, but nevertheless, I hope I can also make a few general points, very likely repetitive. Let me start out. Since my lens is the Indian lens, as soon as I saw the report, my eye actually went straight on the title in Hindi, which says calm. And I said, wow, under Wolfowitz we were doing corruption, then under Bob Zelig we were doing climate change, and now calm. The word Kama Sutra is derived from calm. And so I was quite puzzled. But then, as I was walking out of my office taking the elevator, this is where, we advertise all the events that happen in SIPA. And there was a poster saying, sex lecture on sustainable development. So I figured, well, if Colombia can have a sex lecture on sustainable development, surely the World Bank can have a WDR and implications of calm on development. So, any case, that's a little humor. But let me start my context is India, and let me just begin very, very briefly, build towards it. Now, here I sort of see that in the report, at least certainly in the way also Martin made his third point today just now, that there is a bit of this skepticism that, labor markets may not be the labor market distortions may not be the big problem that you're looking for, so be careful before you touch them. I certainly see that. I mean, it's certainly very widespread in India. I'm going to question that. So for those of you who may not know about India, very quick, broad picture. So in the last 20 years, here are growth rates given to you starting from 1950. But in the last 20 years, about on the average, India has grown about 7% a year, which is very substantial. With similar rates of growth, actually, a little higher. I think I shouldn't say similar, but closer to maybe 9 to 10%. In 2 decades, South Korea in the 60s and 70s, Taiwan again also in 60s and 70s, and China more recently, eliminated pretty much poverty completely, at least the abject poverty, which is what we look at in India. India has had a lot of success reducing poverty with growth. There's no question that growth was very important. And for a long period, you got about 3.5 decades, starting from 1950 to mid-1980s, you see no decline in the trend poverty. It sits like a flat line. And then, with growth, as growth begins to happen, incomes begin to rise, poverty does decline significantly, no doubt, and consistently across all social groups. So I've given you the numbers here at the national level for each social groups. You can do it at the state level. However you slice it, poverty has certainly declined by religious groups, Hindus, Muslims, etc. However, in 2 decades, poverty is still quite substantial. And remember, this is abject poverty we are looking at. And what is the puzzle here? I mean, why is it that these other countries really, although with slightly higher rate of growth, could eliminate abject poverty? And in fact, even by a poverty line that would be higher than the Indian poverty line. What happened? Well, one of the features of the growth process in India, which is very different from all these fast-growing economies, is that manufacturing as a proportion of the GDP sits stagnant. So here you see the picture starting from 1991. 91 is the dividing line when the reforms were systematically begun in India. But you can see that, the bottom line, the blue line, completely stagnant share of manufacturing. And this is completely different from what you have seen in any of the other miracle economies which have grown rapidly, where manufacturing grows very rapidly. Not only that, actually, what you see in these economies is the labor-intensive manufacturing that grows very rapidly, and in the process, therefore, pulls in a lot of the workers out of agriculture into gainful employment in manufacturing. And that's the process that has not really taken off in India. The industries that have grown rapidly in India are either highly capital-intensive or skilled labor-intensive. So you've got automobiles doing well, two-wheelers doing very well, the agricultural machinery doing very well, engineering goods doing very well, even petroleum refining doing very well, or you got the software industry, pharmaceuticals, but nothing about the apparel industry, for instance, which is what creates good jobs. That's the sort of industry which has really stagnated in India. And so the transition of the workforce, whereas agriculture has declined significantly from about 30% to now 15% of the GDP, employment, the movement of the workers out of agriculture into non-agricultural jobs has been extremely slow. Some movement, but not a whole lot. Within the rural, first of all, you can see on the right-hand side, the rightmost bars will tell you that urbanization has proceeded extremely slowly in India. Extremely slowly. You got the 2 decades period here during which you go from about 26% to 31%, hardly 5 to 6 percentage points of expansion. Very, very slow. And likewise, then within the rural area, so you got still 70% of the population in rural areas, and you got still about you go from 78% of employment in agriculture to 68%. Very slow movement when you compare it to any of the other fast-growing economies, and that really is the crux of the problem. And to me, it is the labor market reforms which really are the critical feature. Now, if you look at the labor legislation in India, you go from 6 to 7 workers, you go from 9 to 10 workers, you got 19 to 20 workers, you got 49 to 50 workers, 99 to 100 workers. There is a cascading of demands on you of all kinds as an entrepreneur by the labor laws. And by the time you get to 100, basically you hit a law which says that in effect, if you want to lay off any worker whatsoever under any circumstances for any reason, you got to get permission from the Labor Department, and the Labor Department in the last 30, 40 years has just not given these permissions, and therefore the effect of that legislation is that you can never fire a regular worker. And there are these legal cases where these layoffs have been fought for 30 years. The worker, when the case starts, is a young man, and then by the time case is resolved, he's actually retired. I mean, that's the sort of legal battles some of the firms have tried to fight. The result, of course, is that the Indian entrepreneur simply runs away from hiring workers. Lots of studies which show you that in the capital, first of all, the industrial structure is highly kind of lopsided in favor of capital-intensive industries. Then even within the industries, capital-to-labor ratios on average are much higher than in the comparable economies. And progressively, the latest case we have had, there was a big strike actually in the plant Maruti. This is the leading car manufacturer, the largest one. And some of the management guys actually were killed in the strike. And now the plant managers have said, well, we were 90% automated. Now we are going to be 99% automated in the next 6 months. So this is the kind of response that happens. And that, of course, means that, the structure, the employment structure, when you look at the firm size, is just incredibly different in India than what you see in other countries. And my point of comparison here is China. So this is really the most telling slide. This is from a paper by Rana Hassan and Carl Jendok. This is, I think you have, the WDR actually looks at that study in an earlier version, but afterwards I think now it has been redone quite a bit. But this is one picture if you look at it. This is the distribution of the employment by firm size in apparel industry in India and China. You can see India is the mirror image of China, meaning that, opposite of China. So 85% of the workers in apparel industry are in firms that are 8 workers or less. Actually, about 75% are in firms with 4 workers or less. And you go down, there is nothing. And as you go to the larger side, people say that, there is a missing middle in India. For which there is a good reason, because if you bite the bullet in India, you bite it and then go all the way to the large size. So in the middle, there is no incentive, because at every expansionary stage, demands are being made on you to do more and more and more. And so you go all the way. If you bite the bullet, you go all the way down up there. But in the apparel industry, there is not a missing middle. There is missing everything other than the very small. You look at China, you'll see that, about more than 50% of their, almost About 50% of their firms, more than 50 actually, are large firms, cutting it at 200 workers or more. And another 30% are in the medium size. There's nothing in that range, virtually nothing, in India. That really is the tragedy of the Indian employment. So you see this, that 95%. The organized private sector in India employs today about 10.8 million workers. This is a workforce of 430 million workers. So this is, this percentage, if you work out, 2.5% of the workforce is basically in the organized sector. Now, you can argue anything about the definitions of organized, unorganized, etc., but this is certainly not optimal. And the question then is, again, you come back and say, oh, but there may be other factors, etc. So Rana Hassan actually went in and looked at some of the evidence. Well, part of it, you can see this shows back. So here I give you the export figures of India as a proportion of Bangladesh and China, and see what is going on. I mean, the proportions are not only declining, but they're so low. By 2007, India was about as much as Bangladesh and about 1/10 of China. This is the exports of apparel. He's got a country with 430 million workers, and this is all it exports. I mean, this is where China is now exiting the apparel sector with its wages rising. India is clearly the country should be doing it, but until the labor market regime is sorted out, this is not going to happen. Now, last slide I'll show you, and this is what Rana Hassan's big point was. Look, if you divide, even in this very inflexible labor market regime, you've got some states that are kind of less inflexible and some that are more inflexible. And so let's divide those, and there are now agreed upon indices of labor market flexibility. And so he says, well, let's look at the firm size distribution across states which have more flexible labor markets and states that have less flexible labor markets. And you see a significantly different distribution. That certainly is reasonably convincing, compelling evidence to me that you see very clearly much the concentration of larger firms in the flexible labor market regime states versus the non-flexible ones. He then also tries to look at can the alternatives explain the same? So at least for infrastructure, he tries to look at if you get similar kind of split between states with good infrastructure and states with bad infrastructure, you don't get that split. So to me, it really is. So Martin, you're going to be the chief economist in India. Your skepticism is going to face my optimism on labor market reforms. So we shall see. But I think labor market reforms really, because product market reforms have been largely done in India. You can still complain about a few things here and there. I mean, it's no doubt, you can always, particularly agriculture remains quite distorted, but it is really that factor markets, both land and labor actually. Capital still is being done, has progressed a lot more. But labor and land markets are the two major constraints, and I think even between those, as far as this good jobs are concerned, ultimately the constraint is the labor markets, and that's where India has a very tough battle to fight over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arvind. Well, I was asked to say a few words before inviting the audience to ask questions, of course, related to the presentation. But, what comes to mind, I've been in all sessions here, and what comes to mind is what somebody said. I think it was Rudy Dombush. I don't remember who exactly was. He said, if you are good with a hammer, you will see nails everywhere. And that's the feeling I have after listening to all the presentations here, is that we heard from all of the speakers different views, but in a way biased towards, of course, what they know best, which I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not different. But the beautiful thing about this is that the report, the holistic approach of the report that has dissected, I think, the employment sector, or the jobs, allows you to incorporate all these comments that we have been collecting in this conference. My only, if you wish, recommendation, and more as a consumer of issues and research than on the developing world has to do with the fact that we are seeing is that the developing world goes to cycles of output collapse. And during these cycles of output collapse, many of the good things that were achieved during the good times are lost. Therefore, once those things are lost, it's very difficult to continue constructing on what has already been achieved. And I'm not referring to social protection policies. I'm referring to protecting jobs. And again, as a consumer of the research that has been produced on developing countries, we all know that this output collapse have a lot to do with credit. And we haven't seen much discussion in the conference on issues related to credit. I think Ned brought the issue of education, and he highlighted two things. He said, we have countries that have very good education, but yet the movement or development, it's been very slow. Marty also highlighted issues related, which is very much related to what I was saying, the downloading of risk from the lead firms that has on the smaller firms. And I think that has to do also with a developing world where output is very volatile. Santiago also talked about the problems that poor fiscal or tax regime could have on jobs. And Arvind, of course, talked about the labor reform. So all these issues that we heard in this table are under the fundamentals. And I think that perhaps a little more emphasis, this is my recommendation to the team, a little more emphasis on the fundamentals. In particular, the issue of credit has been in the same bag as infrastructure and regulation. And I think that what we have learned from the recent crisis and even during the good times, how important is credit to facilitate all these changes that we are hoping to see in order to promote development. So that's my contribution. And I would like to invite the audience to ask questions to the panelists.
Andreas Wergötter from OECD. The question is actually to Ned. I mean, my refreshed memories of the Phelps-Nelson 1966 paper is that this is a one good or one sector model. It doesn't differentiate between manufacturing and services. And I mean, more recently, some evidence or some thinking is going in the direction that what is needed for new products and new technologies to be commercialized is actually a very differentiated structure of services, while most of the innovation is coming from manufacturing. And therefore, I mean, the question would be whether maybe more of a sectoral approach that is also sort of quite dominant for the World Development Report might be important for better understanding what are the foundations for economic growth in the future. Sectoral approach meaning differentiating between manufacturing and services.
This is a question to Arvind. I mean, you made a strong case that employment protection laws are very constraining in India. But what we see in most other countries is when you have laws that are so constraining, as Santiago said, you have informalization. You basically have large firms getting around the laws and in that way nullifying the effect of the law. is enforcement that good in India that these laws can have such a big effect on actual economic behavior? Why aren't we seeing the informalization that occurs, the getting around the law that occurs in most other places?
Yeah, I'm an old guy, so I remember the 1980s. Everybody in India said, oh, we can get around this licensing regime. It's not a barrier. So we had these, absolute licensing on imports. Nothing could be imported without a license. And of course, large parts of the goods were off the limits, meaning they were prohibited entirely. So you were not allowed, even a license will not be issued, it's very clear. Investment was subject to incredible licensing. Every sector was covered by it. But he said, we get around it. Of course, getting around is extremely costly, which we discovered. So in the last 20 years, you see an incredible restructuring of the industry as a result of the giving up of the licensing and imports, as well as investment. So getting around is possible, but it is costly. And that shows up itself in this very lopsided distribution of the firms. There is a contract labor provision, which, so progressively firms have gone to hire contract labor. But then you get the kind of strikes that I described, actually, where the management, people in the management get killed because parity is sought between the contract workers and the regular workers. It's inevitable that when two workers are working side by side and one gets 1/5 of the salary of the other, they're doing the exact same thing. You would expect that kind of reaction. So it's getting around is possible, but it is very costly, which will then ultimately show up in the kind of firm size distribution that I showed you. So you get these firms which are incredibly tiny. It's only in the capital-intensive sectors you see large firms in India on a large scale. So auto sector, you'll find large firms there because you can't run an auto plant at 50 workers or something. So that's where you see, but it's a costly affair, and India certainly, and the cost really has fallen as a result on the workers themselves, because those who are protected are fine, but 95% of the workers have no protection whatsoever. There is no social safety net either from the public sector side or from any sort of, the only social safety net that was created was this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in the rural areas, but even there's such large leakages in the system, so not a whole lot goes through. I think, that way Santiago had a much better idea of having cash transfers. India's kind of not talking about it. But the point is that you got 95% of the workforce or 90% of the workforce you force into the informal sector where there's absolutely no protection whatsoever. That is the getting around.
I have a question for Arvind, and I look forward, after 20 years, for discussing and working together as we did in the Trade Policy Division incarnations ago. And my question to you is, I think one way to call it is first best or second best. And in the following way, we clearly use the India example as a country that has fallen off the cliff in terms of rigidity. The Industrial Disputes Act of India, I don't think anyone will object to that analysis, and we have discussed it extensively with Rana and all that. But what the final question in the report, in the structure of the report, where every chapter finishes with a difficult question, is, well, what do you do in those cases? And the final question is how to reallocate labor. So the point that John was discussing in his intervention is, well, you want to get some of these reallocation to high productivity jobs. How do you go about it when you have things like the Industrial Disputes Act? And what we did there was to say, well, it's true, first best is to reform that, and India has been up to that for 60 years since it was created, and 7 provinces have gone in the direction of more flexible, but 6 have gone in the direction of less flexible. So the political hope is, sure, maybe one can have some magic bullet that will unleash some political process of change, but one may say it's unlikely. And then we looked at other countries that had equally horrible things. Sri Lanka has exactly the same Industrial Disputes Act because it was inherited from the British. That was passed by the British before leaving. China has the hukou system. I think it's difficult to think of something that on paper is a worse regulation than something that prevents people from moving out of agriculture to cities. For Brazil, we had a study a decade ago showing how bad the system of labor policies and regulations was. Indermit Gill was the one who led that study, and when we asked him, well, have things gotten any better in terms of policy? He said, no, it's the same thing. And yet these countries have managed to accomplish a phenomenal change. Sri Lanka has a garment industry that was successful. China is a model of urbanization. Brazil has these very dynamic cities in the south where a lot of job creations happen. And so our message in the end is, well, if you cannot go through it, go around it. And the other big thing that seems to be missing in India, and you showed it, is urbanization. You say land remain distorted, secondary cities where a lot of poverty and little wage employment is. So my question to you, and perhaps almost as advice for my next job, is first best or second best?
Yeah, well, first of all, I won't take your pessimistic view that, nothing can be done. This is what we were told in the 80s about the licensing regime, that forget it, this is never going to change, India cannot change. I mean, today, I'm astonished where we are. I mean, I never thought I'll see this in my lifetime, at least didn't think in the 1980s that we'll be where we are, where India is today. So things can change. So, I mean, I remain quite optimistic on that. In fact, attempts to fix at least this one major problem of layoffs was tried actually in the previous government, the Vajpayee government regime. They, in fact, had a bill which was raising this limit from 100 to 1,000 workers. And that was a way to kind of introduce the change that from 1,000 you do 5,000, 10,000, what have you. So you basically gradually move away from this very strict limit at 100 on layoffs. Didn't work. They tried 300, didn't work. So, and then they lost the election. So that was misfortune of the country, and so. But that does not mean that change cannot come. There are a variety of ways to bring change. For example, you could grandfather everybody who is employed today. That whoever is employed for now remains under the old regime. For the new regime, there is a new set of laws. You could go selectively. That look, apparel has hardly any large-scale sector. So and even within that, you could protect the workers who are already there in the large firms. And then any other employment that happens in apparel sector is under a new regime. So there are a variety of ways. I mean, Bangladesh has massively reworked its labor laws into a single law in 2006, which really streamlines almost everything. So these are things that can be done. I remain optimistic, and we have to keep fighting on rather than say that, well, nothing can be done and therefore try to get around, because that getting around has been going on for the last 3 decades, and there has not been much getting around as far as I can see.
Santiago?
No, I just want to add a little bit to Martin's question, because I think it's extremely relevant, and it really illustrates the dilemmas. So my reaction is very much like yours. If you can't change it, doesn't mean give up and that's it. But if you can't change it, do whatever else is on the rest of the milieu, and you'll get some gains, and certainly you can improve things on the tax side, on the labor training side, on the land side. There are a whole bunch of other things, and I think that's the message of the report, which is welcome, that you can do that will improve the quality of jobs and will raise productivity. And so that part is very welcome. I think the point that Arvind was making, and sort of in a way I was also making, is that doesn't mean that those policies are not costly. You're just reducing the cost through other ways. They're still there, they're still costly. And I think the real challenge for us economists is to understand why they're there. They're partly for ideology reasons maybe, but partly for real reasons. Those employment protection laws are providing some sort of insurance, are solving some sort of a problem. And I think, at least in Latin America, the reason why it's been so difficult to reform them is because we haven't proposed anything better. And so the real challenge is, what is better in terms of equity and efficiency than the current one, than just simply arguing, get rid of it?
Martin?
Sara, yes.
I don't see anything.
Okay. I'm just going to venture into the India story, if I may. A puzzle for some of us observers is we do agree, let's say, that hiring and firing are very restrictive in India, but that applies to something like 7% of the workforce. So we can't explain 95% of the workforce being informal based on strict hiring and firing. And the threshold for this cuts in is not the 8 and below. It's much further higher up the chain. So I always find that explanation as the sole explanation very, I would approach it with caution. And a part of the China story has to be, compared to India, has to be infrastructure. Part of the China-India story has to be investment by the state. And another real worry in India is, manufacturing GDP may have been stagnant. Agriculture GDP has gone down, and yet the share of the workforce in agriculture has not gone down nearly as fast. So I think in addition to the missing manufacturing middle, we really do have a problem with agriculture. And we also have a problem that the growth was led by IT services, which is more capital than labor intensive and requires, at least for entry into call centers, high school education in English. So I think there's a bigger set of puzzles and challenges in India than just labor market reforms. Yeah, we have
and this is exactly on this 95%, we can go make that 100% actually. We are moving in that direction.
Professor, my name is Samuel, and I took a great interest in your intervention, Professor Panagariya, on India, because you talk about that growth was pretty much has to do with the power sector. And we know that most likely these kind of sectors, they are labor intensive and they have low productivity. So how do you manage in India to keep that sector competitive compared to the rest of the world? And secondly, since this kind of labor can have very low wage, so how do you manage to have the sector have a reasonable wage level?
I mean, look, the country I look at for this is China, where labor markets, to me, no matter what you say, Martin, these restrictions were not in the industry. These restrictions were on the movement of the workers in agriculture or where they were. But once you were willing to forego, once the returns up there in the industry or urban sector became large enough, you were willing to forego your benefits that were tied down to your location. And so, at least on the magnet was doing its job, and it was some bolting down of the workers which had to be unbolted, and once the incentives become large enough, people moved. And so I really see China as the sort of model here that, look, what you need is have the regime at least some incentives in there for the larger firms to emerge. This is not going to destroy the middle or the smaller ones. The middle and smaller ones will typically become the ancillaries of the larger ones. But without there being any large firms or substantial large firms, there's no way you're going to capture those export markets. If you are a firm with 5 workers or 8 workers, your customers are within 10-mile radius of where you are. In occasional cases, these small firms might hook up to some, export house or something, and but it's a very costly way to organize exports. In India, tried to do that for several decades. But in the end, you've got to, at least especially in sectors like apparel, got to let the large-scale firms emerge at a fairly significant scale so that you hook up in the big world export market. And then, of course, as I say, the growth of the medium and small will probably end up being actually better with large firms being present than it is without them.
First, I'm really happy Arvind is here because I was working with Martin on that final question, and a lot of material I borrowed from Arvind's new book on emerging giant. So I'm from China, so I'm not expert on either countries, but I tried hard to find data to answer this question. So I was looking at the picture. One question came out is again, what John and Sara was mentioned, color is the data issue. From what I know, for India, we have both unorganized and organized sector, so we have better picture of the firm distribution. But for China, generally what we have is above scale, survey of firms or census of firms. So it's generally formalized firms or small, about certain threshold firms, not by size but by sales. And also from some case studies, especially on apparel and textile industry, especially apparel, what I heard is, for instance, in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, actually there are lots of very small household. They contract out of the tasks from the bigger firms. So there is really a supply chain from the bigger ones you're talking about through the small ones. It's not like, I found that actually similar to the ecosystem you're talking about in India, right? Because the bigger firms or medium-sized firms want to circumvent this restriction of employment size or dispute act. So they actually contract out to contract firms or contract out to informal workers. So actually the structure seems similar from what I learned between China and India. And another issue is also China is special, right? It's like a transition country. Many of those bigger firms in apparel and textile, it's actually state-owned enterprise and then privatized. So there's, how is dynamic come from? Okay, so that's all.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is there anything you would like to add? I have a last question that for Ned that I was curious to have an answer, although he put it in a question, whether entrepreneurship could be learned. Do you think that for the U.S. too, or you have in mind the developing world?
Well, of course, at the level of the individual, probably a huge number of things could be learned with enough time and patience and, I'm sorry. Well, I'm a little puzzled by the question, Sara. I mean, India is famous for being entrepreneurial. China is famous for being entrepreneurial, too. Somebody told me that one of the major British economists in the 18th century exclaimed, I've forgotten who it was, exclaimed that, my gosh, 1800 China is so entrepreneurial. So I don't know whether a lack of entrepreneurship is a big problem in development. What I think is important, and I hope you will allow me to give this as an answer to the question, what I think is important is innovatorship. And innovatorship is not the same as entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship means hustle, it means drive, it means having quite a lot of practical knowledge on the ground of what's going on in the industry, or what are the problems, how does the business work and everything. Well, innovatorship requires a whole lot of other things. It requires an intellectual drive, not so much a desire to act as a desire to know, to discover, to find out. There were a couple of brothers in Minneapolis decades ago, the Bradley brothers, and they said that, well, innovation comes from a new model in somebody's head, and the desire to show the world or show some people that your new model works, that you can build this new product and it will be loved by the public and adopted. And you demonstrate your greater understanding in that way. I mean, that's just one of the motivations. Another would just be intellectual curiosity. You're curious to see whether this will go in the marketplace. You find it fascinating to see what is liked and what is not liked. I mean, the movie business and the record business must be a lot like that. It must be fascinating. It must be fascinating to see what's going to be a hit and what's going to be a flop. So I don't know whether these things can be learned. I don't know whether these things can be taught in a systematic way. Yes, I guess I incline to agree that they can be learned. If somebody grows up in an innovative culture, maybe if she or he is the daughter or son of people who are in some innovative business, then probably a lot of that can be soaked up from age 6 at the dinner table right on up. So yes, I think there's an opportunity for learning. Maybe you meant learning by doing, though. Well, there's also that. I mean, an innovator doesn't generally score successes first time around the track. You learn from experience, learn from mistakes. Yes, in general, I'm sure learning is very important.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, everybody. Just let's applause for the panel and invite you.